And then we're going to move back across the water and talk about post-World War II Palestine. Okay, so the development of the Jewish state of Israel, basically. Since the late 1800s, one of the places that Jewish people fled from European countries. And one of the things you have to understand is that the idea of a unified Jewish nation throughout Europe was a myth, okay? But it was something that anti-Semitic people really liked to talk about. They liked to talk about the fact that Jews were all united together into this sort of amorphous nation that crossed the globe, and that was where their loyalty lies, and therefore, you know, you can't really trust them to be good Germans or good Frenchmen or anything like that, because they have this other loyalty to the Jewish nation, which was not actually a thing. But what happens when you push a lot of people out of various countries and they all kind of drift to the same area is that they end up sort of forming an actual, you know, Jewish state. So since the late 19th century, since the middle of the 1800s, Jewish people who had fled out of Europe, out of waves of anti-Semitism out of Europe, had gone to Palestine, which was a British holding. The British had less anti-Semitism than a lot of European countries. As a matter of fact, they had a Jewish prime minister at the beginning of the 1900s. So British areas tended to be less anti-Semitic, not completely anti-Semitic, but less than a lot of European countries. So they fled to Palestine in the hope of going back to the holy city of Jerusalem, which was there, and the basic, you know, holding of the Jewish Holy Land. Before World War II, there were several attempts to establish an immigrant population, sort of a place for them to go in Palestine. But after the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of people fled to that place, and there was this wave of people that came in. The problem is that Jerusalem is not just heavily occupied by Jews. Jerusalem is also a holy city to Christians, and it is also a holy city to Muslims, because it is the place where I'm just realizing that the caption I have under this slide is wrong, and I'll have to fix it before I. Anyway, it's also a holy place to Muslims because of part of, you know, Muhammad's history. So the idea after World War II, the negotiation that they have, is to establish an independent Jewish state, an independent Muslim state, and make Jerusalem its own space that doesn't belong to either one, that's not the capital of either one. Okay, that's the idea. The problem is that that never has worked. Okay, over the course of the from the end of World War II all the way up to the present day, we're still fighting over whose space that actually is, who gets to live there, who gets rights in those spaces. Conflicts in this region are not just about religion, they are power fueled by religion. There's a lot of religious fire behind them, but really the issue is that this is an extremely valuable economic area, because all trade in the Mediterranean Sea comes through this area. So this place, especially this strip, the Gaza Strip, this is Israel, and this particular part is disputed. It's disputed territory between those two states. So control of Jerusalem itself is ugly. I want to talk more about this when we talk about globalization, because we make the mistake of thinking that this is all a religious argument, that it's Muslims and Jews and Christians all facing off against each other. It's not. Largely, it's an economic battle. And that has more to do with globalism than anything else, which we'll talk about next week. Right after World War II, on this peninsula, on the other side of this, on this peninsula, oil was discovered. Oil was discovered by a family who's the wealthy royal family of the Saud. The Saud family established that there was oil on their holdings and became an extremely valuable resource. The Saudi Arabian Peninsula, this wealthy family fueled by oil united the entire peninsula under one government, which was the Saudi Arabian government. And then they networked all of their oil resources and started becoming a target for invasion, basically. They formed alliances with various powers in the hopes of maintaining their sovereignty over their own oil supply, and found out that that basically made them a target for invasion. So Saudi Arabia, I don't know how much familiarity you guys have with the Middle East. I think we, as Americans who don't actually study it, we tend to think of all of this area as desert and rocks and stuff like that, not realizing that places like Kuwait were like Beverly Hills in Saudi Arabia, even richer. You know, that was where, you know, there was like an entire city of Rodeo Drive.
Is that where Dubai is?
Dubai?
And that's over to the
Yeah.
east, northeast of that.
Yeah, no, it's, but it is also an incredibly wealthy modern city too. So with the rise of oil, what we have here is an area that is economically, technologically advancing very, very quickly, because they trade on their oil for other things. They trade on their oil for technology, for prestige, for the wealth of, you know, all of the Western governments basically, and they build themselves up into this incredibly modern area. The reason that we think of them as a place, many of the Middle Eastern countries, as places that have primitive ideologies is because of a wave that happened later, because of a wave of ideologies that comes through later. But it becomes a place that oil-hungry neighbors like Iraq tend to invade. Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a funky country. I'm sorry, but the assets, the resources of Afghanistan are, it's a lot of rocks and plains and not a lot of, but it's so positioned to be right in the middle of everything that you kind of have to control Afghanistan in order to control trade between the Mediterranean and Asia. You have to control Afghanistan. So wave after wave after wave of people tried to control Afghanistan before World War II. Okay. As the world split into places that were Allied sphere of influence and places that were Soviet sphere of influence, Afghanistan was right in the middle of that. So it becomes like a target point for all of this. So this is one of those moments, Afghanistan is one of those moments where the US, in order to contain communism, backed a very different idea, poured money into a very different idea, starting in 1979. So after the Vietnam War, it's important that we note that this is after having lost the Vietnam War. America decided to fund rebel groups that were willing to kick out Soviet communists, okay? It started off with about $600,000 worth of support, but within a couple of years, it was $20 to $30 million of CIA support every year that poured into this area, poured money for weapons, training, various and sundry consultants whose job it was to rally tribal, is that a good word, tribal? I guess so, yeah. Rebellious forces against the Soviet Union, which had control of Afghanistan. Among those was the Mujahideen, which was sort of a religious leader and sort of a military leader. And he drew towards him all of these sects of various religious fanaticism, and then armed them and built them into sort of an army. It was a very loose confederation, and it was exactly the kind of garden in which weeds were going to grow, basically, because if you came into it full of fire to establish Afghanistan as a sovereign place where, you know, the teachings of Muhammad could grow, and you got there and you realized that you were working with a commander who had made deals with Christian Western people, then maybe you want to take it a step further than he did, and maybe you want to create a more fanatic group. And so within this very, very well funded by the CIA garden, all of these fanatic ideologies sort of spring up. And in the midst of that, for example, Osama bin Laden comes in. And Osama bin Laden was a billionaire, millionaire. He was a millionaire. His family was extremely rich, oil millionaires who had come in, say again?
Construction was their main thing.
Didn't they start as oil magnates?
I think it was all King's construction.
Okay, I'll say anyway, they were very rich. And Osama bin Laden was the son of this family, and he brought his resources to bear to the Mujahideen and didn't really like the way he was running things. So he ended up establishing a separate, but still fundamentally pointed in the same direction group. So they do manage to push the Soviet Union out at some point, but they don't particularly want to then turn this area of influence over to Western allies either, because they have gone to so much trouble to establish themselves as a sovereign power themselves. And so instead they begin a military campaign of pushing out against Western forces and against Soviet forces to establish their own sovereignty. The problem is, of course, that since they're made out of so many different groups, in order for one group to impose sovereignty, they have to crack down on all the others. And so what you end up with is probably the strictest version, the most aggressive form of that fanaticism. So if you take World Civ I, we talk a lot about the rise of Islam and what Muslim people believe in the beginning and how that manifests. And it's very tempting to think that the fanaticism of aggressive, militant, terroristic forces that identify as Muslim are people that have maintained some sort of, ever since the first militant Muslims, they've just held on to it. But it's actually a new flavor of Islam. It's a new thing that only comes up after World War II, where somebody reaches back, takes the teachings of somebody early on, and exploits them as a pro-military, aggressive, invasive, imposing, I am allowed to kill my neighbor if they're not Muslim ideology. But that's new after the end of World War II. So we make a mistake of thinking that it's very old and that what's happened is that Muslims were always like that, and then they've just gotten nicer as the world has gotten bigger. But that's actually not true. They started out as internally improving people, but there were certain catchphrases that you could take out of context if you needed to, in order to rally support around this very aggressive pro-military. There's going to be a showdown between the Muslims and Christians, and we're going to inherit the whole world, and so it's okay for us to invade our neighbors and impose this Muslim ideology. Wahhadi?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the Wahhadi sort of train of belief. So starting with the end of World War II, and especially with 1979 with Operation Cyclone, which is American-funded CIA assistance to fanatical Muslim tribal peoples to overthrow the Soviet Union, this whole area becomes a place that has never, I think, stopped fighting since then. And of course, it wasn't just America. Operation Cyclone also included a large influx of assistance from the UK, from Great Britain. I mean, anybody Sherlock fans? Do we have Sherlock fans in here?
The movement, with Benjamin.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but that's Dr. Watson's whole military experience is fighting in Afghanistan as a military doctor. So there's a reason for that. Okay, so we have this pocket of conflict around the Eastern Mediterranean, right along the Gaza Strip between Israel and Palestine. We have this pocket of conflict around the Middle East, especially in Afghanistan. Let's talk about China. Okay, now China has, we've looked at China enough in this class that one of the defining characteristics of China is its willingness to adopt an invader, is its willingness to allow a new force to come in and redefine it, because that's actually a long-standing part of China's history. Invaders come in and China becomes what the invader is, but also sort of changes the invader to become what they are. I guess the same thing sort of happens with communism. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was feudal, just like at the beginning of the 20th century, Soviet Union was feudal. They still had small farms where people used horse-drawn wagons to do their hoeing and work, and very little technology. When in America they had combines that were being invented, and massive industrial revolution in Britain. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was still very much feudal. So by the beginning of the 21st century, the Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union because it had already collapsed, but Russia and China are actually major economic powers who help to dictate the behaviors of the rest of the economic powers of the world. You have to adjust around China. yeah, in the American economy. You have to adjust around what Russia's going to do if you're in the British economy. So it's important to sort of understand how that happens. It starts kind of with the Boxer Rebellion. The Chinese people attempt to overthrow their own, the Qing dynasty attempts to overthrow their own empire in the Boxer Rebellion because it has made too much, it has compromised too much with European powers. There are uprisings right before World War I in China, which turns the country into a parliamentary regime. So it takes the royal family and basically sets them aside and imposes a parliamentary regime, which allows people of wealth to rise to the top. Now, what in any country where wealth rises to the top, you end up with kind of an oligarchy, which if the oligarchy takes care of the working class, then they can maintain power for quite a long time, actually.
The Chinese mob.
What is the Chinese mob?
Yeah, what's the
Communist
name
Party.
of it? This is an objective like answer, but
Oh, you don't know. Okay. I don't know.
Politburo?
Well, okay. I don't actually,
it comes through hustle. Yeah, you know it comes through hustle whenever the you know.
I don't actually.
Jackie Chan.
I'll figure it out.
Okay, you Google and you get back to us. Okay.
Triad.
Yes, that's what it is. Is that the trial?
No,
No, okay, never mind. Continue.
it's the Chinatown.
Okay, so y'all good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so Sun Yat-sen seized power in 1912, seized power of the whole government, and imposed I can't really call it collectivism, I can't really call it communism, it was oligarchic is what it was. Sun Yat-sen established an oligarchic system, and as a result, a small group of people who were heavily influenced by ideologies that were coming out of Moscow began to rise up and form a communist party based on the idea of let's take the wealth from the wealthy and distribute it to the poor, which always sounds like a good idea on paper. It really just kind of matters exactly how it's seized and who seizes it. So in 1919, Communist Party rose up and rebelled against Sun Yat-sen, unsuccessfully at first. Sun Yat-sen still had control of all of the military, and so, do I have? No, I know. Okay, Sun Yat-sen had control of all the military, sort of chased the communists into the mountains, where they built a foundation and drew forces towards them and grew in power until they were able to, and that's what we call the Long March, when the Communist Party was basically chased into the hills. Over the course of about a year, the communists were running and fleeing in large groups and gathering numbers as they went. And then war broke out between China and Japan. This was the attempt Japan made to become an empire and settle in China, and committed atrocities against like Nanking. Japan was attempting to be an empire just like all of the other European countries were trying to establish themselves as empires, I guess. Japan was trying to establish colonization, and China was the closest it could get. So those atrocities were not answered adequately by the government. And as a result of that war, the power of that party that Sun Yat-sen had formed kind of disintegrated. Chris, you look troubled.
I was trying to remember how long the Long March was. It's actually fascinating how long it was.
Oh, well, this is an imperfect.
I was just looking at it.
Yeah. And
5,600 miles over 370 days. That's crazy.
yeah. Yeah, like literally moving. I mean, China's big. I don't know if you know, but China's big. You can chase somebody out of a city in China for a really long
They were
time.
being shot at practically the whole time.
Yeah, and during that time, they were being herded away out of power, but also gathering sympathetic forces as they went. So after Japan invaded China and forced them to submit to all kinds of atrocities, the Chinese Communist Party began to rise because they weren't the ones who had allowed that to happen. Okay, this is an extremely simplistic look at what happened and how communism got its foothold in China. I recommend that if you're interested in this topic, that you take 20th Century Asia with Dr. Waggy, because he's extremely thorough in discussing this whole thing. And one of his favorite people to talk about is Chairman Mao. So the Mao Zedong united the Communist Party and other communist factions and imposed a form of communism that is nationalistic. And again, the ideal communism spans the globe. So all countries' borders disintegrate and all the workers are united. The socialist utopia is not going to happen until the whole world is united in one big socialist utopia. So this is not really Leninist communism exactly, but it is based on the idea that you can force a country to a socialist utopia by taking everything away from everybody and then managing it, yourself. Chairman Mao is an interesting person for a number of reasons. He is anti-academic. He is very provincial. He believes in the wisdom of the peasantry, even though he wasn't one of those. He believes somehow that it's the peasants who have the real answers, and so he believes that urban youth should be sent out to work in the countryside and get them some country education before they get to have any kind of power, which is an interesting idea. Since they're being sent out to the country to properties that are owned by the central government anyway, that's basically just moving the labor force around. He is kind of crazy. If you want to look up an interesting character, you should Google why Mao Zedong was weird, because there's like a plethora of reasons, things that he did that were very strange. One of the things that happened in Russia is that Stalin, after taking power, moved his population around and began to establish industrial centers inside Russia that were between World War I and World War II, that allowed him to build up an industrial revolution in a place that had been feudal at the beginning of the 20th century. He basically pushed his country through an industrial revolution. Mao Zedong thinks he can do the same thing. He thinks that he can force Chinese peasantry and countrymen to produce steel and thereby make China competitive in a world that requires steel, that requires iron, that requires industrial products. What actually happens is that whole areas of the countryside stop making agriculture, but don't actually have the ore to make those, steel and those products. So they just tear down things and melt them together and hope nobody notices that this isn't actual steel. The management of the Industrial Revolution is much worse in China than it is in Russia, and that's not saying a lot because it was bad in Russia. The other thing that he engaged in was the Cultural Revolution. As his own power began to wane, one of the things that came to light was the fact that landlords all throughout the Chinese rural regions, that landlords had a lot of power. So the people who managed the land were able to treat the peasants any way they wanted to. Mao Zedong encouraged people to rise up against their own landlords and overthrow them bloodily, violently, if necessary, in the early part of his reign. And as a result, collectivization was much easier because the landlords had all been sort of overthrown. He tried to do the same thing in the cities with the academics, with the people that had sort of a stranglehold on culture. And so they engaged in what was called the Cultural Revolution, which was Mao calling on the young people to rise up and overthrow the older people inside the cities. This was for about 10 years. The Cultural Revolution was a call on young people to destroy their own elders and peasants, to overthrow their own landlords. During this time, Mao's own committee, the Politburo that was surrounding him, was kind of sequestering him and removing powers from him and sort of cornering him in his own house until he died. And when he died, the party that emerged was okay, now we can impose some sanity on this situation. And so the party that emerged after Chairman Mao was, they still imposed strict concentration camps, re-education camps for people that disagreed with them, but they had a broader idea of what needed to be re-educated. They didn't have Mao's kookiness about how his people should behave. So for a little while after Mao Zedong dies, China is able to sort of take a breath and restructure itself. And as a result, begins to position itself as an economic power. Again, globalization, which we'll talk about next week. But like there are moments in China's history during this time where they realize that this is not healthy. Like for instance, they want to lend aid to Vietnam, to North Vietnam specifically. They want to lend aid to North Vietnam to battle the South Vietnam with the assistance of the US, sort of troops. And they realize that they don't have any way of competing with Allied troops. Their weapons technology is so far behind. At one point, they try to invade North Vietnam and get their asses kicked, basically, because, yeah. So they find out very quickly that this method of imposing government collectivization and trying to control the population doesn't lend itself very well to innovation. It doesn't make it easy for people to, which is also kind of what the Soviet Union figures out. George Kennan, who proposed the idea of containment, said that if you locked in communism with a big, if you contained it, if you just surrounded it and didn't let it grow, that it would die out internally, that it would just rot from the inside out because it was a flawed structure. And he proposed the idea that that was something that could happen, and then the American government and like the British government and other governments took what he said to heart literally and tried to impose barriers around the Soviet Union. The economic barrier, which was the Marshall Plan, by pouring money into the communities around it so that they wouldn't become communist, and the military boundary that they put around it by funding anti-communist rebellions and trying to prevent communism from getting a foothold in any of these places. The USSR's expansion does actually end up sort of getting contained as a result of these two things, more because of the Marshall Plan than because of military containment, because the communism that shows up outside the USSR isn't dependent on the USSR. It's just nationalistic communism. It's just communism in Cuba is run by Cubans and is to enforce the sovereignty of Cuba, not to be a part of the grand global communist picture. So it sort of works. But what happens inside the Soviet Union is that they find out, and this is a shock to everybody, that if you control all the assets of a country through a small committee, that small committee will attract corrupt, greedy people. And that to rise up to that committee at a local level, you have to not say anything that people don't want to hear. And so what happens inside the Soviet Union is that innovation dies out. The marketplace of free ideas dies out. And what happens is gradually over time, everything in the USSR stagnates. Now, there are forces that are trying to stay competitive on purpose with outside the USSR, for example, the arms race. There are whole, areas of the USSR that were dedicated to competitive arms race development. But a sudden flare of innovation for somebody was often stamped out because it didn't follow the agenda of the people that were already in power, and it was viewed as a way to try to gain power for yourself. So let me make sure that we're clear about that. There's like 4 of us in this classroom right now. If the 4 of us are tasked, right, with coming up with high-ranking committee members' plan for a specific kind of bomb, because he believes that specific kind of bomb is the answer to how we're going to be competitive in the arms race, right? So the 4 of us are tasked with coming up with that kind of bomb. But see, Brooklyn has this idea for a completely different kind of weapon and can either bring that to this committee and have us take it to him and have him feel threatened and therefore have Brooklyn taken out. Or Brooklyn can develop it secretly and be accused of treason, or Brooklyn can just keep her mouth shut and just work on the bomb. So that's the environment that grows in the middle of this, because any attempt to present a new idea is viewed as you're just trying to climb the committee ladder, aren't you, Brooklyn? Yeah, she's nodding back there. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. So during Stalin's time, secret police are highly active. He has lists of assassination targets that he carries out pretty much every day. Death, 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 lunch, death, death, quick shower. That he carries out pretty
I
much.
got that reference.
Good for you. That's not original. That's Eddie Izzard. Anyway, he has that kind of situation, and he becomes more and more paranoid. His police become more and more prolific, and the rise of that police force, which eventually will be the KGB, begins to infiltrate pretty much every area of the Soviet Union, to the point where you don't even know if your neighbor is working for the KGB or not. And so everybody sort of lives in this atmosphere of keep your head down, don't get noticed kind of thing. In 1953, after Stalin dies, there's sort of a period of shuffling of leadership, and the person that takes over, Khrushchev, is actually aware that the only way that they're going to remain competitive is to actually ally, form treaties with, open talks with outside forces, the way that Stalin did during World War II, when he was meeting with Churchill and meeting with Roosevelt. Khrushchev wants to meet with American presidents. He wants to meet with European powers. A lot of this has to do with the Warsaw Pact. I'll get back to that other slide in a second. When all of the allied countries formed together to form NATO, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, and their dependence on being able to park weapons in these areas pointed at each other is sort of critical to mutually assured destruction. It's how we keep peace. And so they have to maintain control over those areas. During this 1950s to 1964, during Khrushchev's time, more focus is put on the arms race, but also in using it as a big chess game. So this isn't the height of the Cold War, really. This is when the Cold War starts being recognized as an actual conflict. It's because Khrushchev is playing chess with all of the other major European powers. Let's have talks, let's back off, but let's also continue to make advances in other areas. And then the era that follows that is the era in which the Brooklyn Bailey thing happens, where people realize that it's not in their best interest to be too innovative, and all of the Soviet innovation starts to drift. They lose their first space race. They lose ground when America puts a man on the moon for the first time. They begin to lose out on other innovations as computers began to move into the world, thanks to the Japanese, who have also stepped up their economic game. They start to lose ground in various areas, and from 1982 to 1991, they slowly collapse like a flan in a cupboard. This guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, who we recognize by his very fascinating birthmark, was part of a new generation of Soviets. He was part of the next generation. He was the youngest person to be appointed to the position of highest leadership in the Soviet Union. And throughout the course of the Soviet Union, that's different. Secretary of the party? No. Prime Minister? No. Supreme Soviet ruler? No. Secretary, yeah, it's different as you go through the history of the Soviet Union. So when he rises to power, he is part of a completely new generation, and he is the youngest person to take that role since Stalin. He is just barely 50, and as a result, he's extremely young. He's part of a new generation that thinks that maybe the Soviet Union has made some fundamental mistakes here, and those should be corrected. And the two things that he puts in place that he introduces to the Soviet idea are perestroika, which is restructuring, which is a document that you have to read, by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika. All you have are small excerpts from it. It's very, very short, 2 pages. But one of the things is we have to stop thinking of all of our political decisions as in response to what America's doing. And America needs to stop doing that too. Basically, they're using the threat of the Soviet Union as a way to campaign in their own country, and that's ridiculous. That needs to stop. So perestroika actually literally means restructuring. And it's the idea of let's focus on what would be the healthiest thing for our own country instead of doing everything in the Soviet Union to compete with countries on the outside. And it's not that he doesn't want to interact, it's that he wants to make Soviet health a higher priority, the Soviet economic health, military health, a higher priority. And that means actually looking at what works and what doesn't. And it's very unpopular with his own people. His own people really hate that he does this, because the other thing he introduces is the idea of glasnost, which literally means transparency, like seeing things through glass.
But if we're being transparent, how are we gonna, be greedy and keep all the resources for ourselves?
Well, it's more sinister than that, actually. And that is, let's let the media say what's really going on here. Because they've had a chokehold on the media since Lenin, basically. Pro-Soviet propaganda is what has been aired. All of the major media outlets have been controlled by the Communist Party. Letting the journalists actually just print what they want to print is not something that Soviet communists do. But his theory was that through glasnost, if you are transparent with what's going on, we'll be able to pinpoint the problems and fix them, and then we will be the strongest Soviet Union ever. What do you think about that idea? Think you're awake?
It'll take a miracle.
Can you spot the flaw? Well, it is actually true that you can't achieve economic, military, social health in a country if you are not willing, any more than you can achieve health for yourself as a body, if you're not willing to look at what the problems are. It's true, that part is true. And Gorbachev believed that the system of the Communist Party, the KGB, the presence of all of that, was actually hindering the truth from getting to the committee. Like, people aren't talking about what's wrong with the Soviet Union because they don't want to get in trouble, so they're just not talking about it, so those things remain wrong. Whereas if you allow people to talk, then we'll be able to fix the problems and we can be the happiest Soviet Union ever.
Okay, wait, but won't they then be too scared to talk because of everything that's been happening in the past?
But his policy is no more punishments for free press, no more, or at least loosening, not so much no more punishments, but let's loosen our control of the press. Let's actually let the media speak for themselves in countries like Bulgaria or Romania or Poland. Let's actually these countries speak for themselves. Immediately, as a result of glasnost, people who disagree with the communist running of these countries begin to have a voice and begin to unite. Now, this might surprise you, but in all these countries where the Soviet Union has controlled, all these countries that are part of the Soviet Union, they have elections all the time, and the communists always win. The communists always vote to put their own people in power and then to remain part of the Soviet Union in all of these media-controlled countries. And Gorbachev sincerely believes that if they have the freedom to speak and the freedom to address their problems, that they will still vote to be communist and they will still vote to be part of the Soviet Union. Weirdly, that's not what happens. Weirdly, as soon as you open the door to media freedom, it turns out that there are so many problems, that there are so many social, economic, welfare problems within the Soviet Union and within the associated countries of the Soviet Union, that parties that had been intending to run against the communists suddenly have all kinds of power. So what happens if you take your hand off of the media control in the communist countries is people who don't like the way the Communist Party is running things are able to garner support. And so in 1991, there's this rolling, starting in kind of 1989, one of the things that happens is the Berlin Wall comes down, as voted for by the East Germans, who now have this, East Germany is its own country, but it's also heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. Most of the support comes through the Soviet Union. So when glasnost comes from the Soviet Union, it comes out in East Germany too. The Berlin Wall comes down, East and West Germany work on uniting into a single country again, which is not communist. Whoa, there's a general strike in Czechoslovakia where communist leaders are overthrown in Czechoslovakia. And then in 1991, when it comes time for election season, one after another, after another, after another, after another of the USSR's countries vote not to be associated with the Soviet Union anymore, which they probably would have done 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago if the media had not been controlled by the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev had this really great idea that if you gave people a voice, they'd say what was wrong and then he could fix it. But what actually happened was, as a result of people having this access to freedom of speech, they actually voted for sovereignty for themselves. And as a result, in 1991, the Supreme Soviet actually voted itself out of existence and disintegrated the Soviet Union, which led to the rise of a brand new country called Russia, all of its own. Russia becomes its own country again. It's no longer the central largest part of the Soviet Union anymore. It's just a country by itself. So, again, globalization, we're going to talk about this later, but the rise of Russia now has to decide what kind of government it's going to have. And the government that comes out of this is not actually communist. The government that comes out of this is actually oligarchic. Russia becomes an oligarchy. All of the strongest, greediest people who had influenced the Communist Party before, and the former KGB agents who had exercised power before, begin to seize control and financial, because at one point they try to split up all of the, everybody receives a small amount of stock in the government-held utilities, and they don't know what to do with these 2 or 3 stocks that they're allocated, so they just sell them to people who are buying them up, and suddenly extremely wealthy people have control of all the major utilities. And that happens to many of the major industries of the Soviet Union, is that people begin grabbing, you know, your 2 stocks and your 2 stocks and your 2 stocks. And now I have 6 stocks plus all the dozens that I've gotten from other places. And now I am myself a power to be reckoned with in this new, basically mafia run Russia. Is basically run by the people with the money and the strength to impose their will. Putin will emerge as prime minister of this messy country at some point, and will hold on to that power for a very long time, up to the present day. But that's globalism, so we'll talk about that later. Okay, so how y'all doing?
I saw where somebody said that Putin looks like Max from Max and Ruby, and now I can't unsee it.
Putin looks like Max from Max and Ruby, huh? I don't think I ever thought about it before. Thanks for that.
Okay, the weirdest thing is I see it now and I'm mad about it.
I can't unsee that.
Yeah, you've just
What's
basically
Max and
infected
Ruby?
an entire.
What's Max
Misery
and
Loves
Ruby?
Company.
What's Max and Ruby?
Awful. It's a like Nickelodeon cartoon.
Oh, what's his
Looks like a
name?
rabbit?
There's like a specific picture. It's like a size profile picture. Yeah. There it is.
Well, yeah, it looks like imitation.
In case y'all are wondering, this is what we're talking about now. I don't know why this is what we're talking about now.
Because I'm ignorant.
Yeah, I want to talk about Putin's influence next week because he's a special problem. Continues to be a special problem. But
He was in the KGB, wasn't he?
Yeah.
he was a KGB agent. He is not a part of that oligarchic founding committee root line. He didn't come from that. He came from the obscurity in the middle of the country, but he rose up through the KGB and now is this guy. This is who he is now. So
What's that word? Not pedigree, but, oh, no, no, that word.
okay.
But you were trying to, his bloodlines, okay. Pedigree.
I mean, that feels right. Not.
Yeah, no, he has no pedigree. He's just
Yeah.
a KGB
That's not
agent. He's not a part of the dynasty. He's not a part of the royal families. He's not an ancient Romanov who has resurfaced, but he wants to cast himself as one.
He's like Rasputin.
A little bit. Maybe he's like, I don't know. Maybe it's like a Harry Potter thing and he's actually the descendant of Rasputin, the secret son. I don't know. I'm sure he would love that. But actually, he probably just is this little guy who came from the country and seized opportunities when he could. And then has tailored propaganda around that, which is the same thing Kim Il-sung did in North Korea.
Who is that? Okay, yeah.
You know, the man who rose to power in North Korea didn't come from anywhere special. He just seized an opportunity when he had it and then created a dynasty of, or a propaganda of heritage and destiny around it. So,
Do you
They
think
all like
Poland,
to-
you think Poland was a big deal too? As much as Czechoslovakia?
yeah, the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact in general and the rebellion of Poland against the USSR pretty much crashed it.
Like Berlin stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much crashed it. The massive strikes in Greece didn't help. But the countries that actually voted, like Bulgaria, like Hungary, and the Ukraine was a big loss to the USSR because the Ukraine is, and Croatia, because it's that, all those states that have control over that,
Balkans.
the Balkans, yeah, those are rich assets to the USSR that voted themselves out of it. And as a result,
Yeah, they never wanted to be a part of it anyway.
no, well, for years they voted to be a part of it.
And now World War III is about to
But the
start.
Red Army was a big.
Kind of, yeah, they felt a little pressure, and it was weird how it was almost always completely,
Yugoslavia was the only independent one, really.
yeah, Yugoslavia established itself as an independent communist nation. So it was weird how in so many of the elections it was across the board 100% support. No, yeah. So, and then all of a sudden, one year it wasn't. And that was because of Glasnost. Okay, anyway, so y'all are going to read this document, Perestroika. It's pretty short, and one of the nice things about primary documents that have been translated into English is that they're not as hard to read as English documents. You'll notice that it's easier to read a primary source that's been translated into English in the modern world than it is to read a.
Unless it's Chinese.
No, I disagree. Ancient Chinese documents that have been translated into English are really easy to read.
It was an instruction manual joke.
Oh, yeah. Well, if they're translated into, never mind. Anyway, I was about to say something inappropriate. So your assignment is just to read Perestroika and answer this question. According to Gorbachev, what are the delusions that the United States is operating under and why won't they work? And that's basically, you just got to find where that is in the document and, put it in your own words. But remember that you have a paper due on what was due last Sunday. Now it's due on Friday. If you haven't already done it, I gave you until Friday to do it. You have a little matching activity in this Perestroika assignment. And next week we are going to start, the last couple of weeks of class are going to be overarching trends instead of chronological things. So we're going to talk about globalization. We're going to talk about pluralization. We're going to talk about new revolutions. And then we're going to talk about the world stage and where we are kind of now. So we're over the course of the next 2 weeks, we're going to arrive at the 2016 election for Donald Trump. So, and the populist elections that happened all over the world during that time. So we're actually going to try to get to 2016 next week, which is not history. It's journalism, but that's okay. I want you to see where the roots of some of these trends come from. So
At what point does something become history?
that's a really good question. We argue about that a lot.
When a generation ends.
But where does the generation end? Like, I hate to tell you this, but 1980 is now as far from us as 1940
Hush.
was from 1980.
Hush.
So the way that we feel about the 1980s is how people in the 1980s felt about the 1940s, because it's the same distance.
Oh, screw you.
I just ruined Chris Howell's whole day. So when does it become history? I don't know. We studied the Vietnam War in 1980 and it had ended in 1975. So I don't know. But what is history? What is the study of history? Like,
The study of documented.
right, the study of the documented past. So you can actually study the history of yesterday if you have the documentation to back that up. But analyzing it is not really useful
When
because-
does grave robbing turn into archaeology?
yeah,
Yeah.
those are questions.
There's some argument that it's always just grave robbing.
Those are the
You
big
have to have the right
questions
permit.
Yeah.
of
Somebody's digging.
yeah, those are the big questions of history, of the study of history. Is we don't know. We don't know at what point we're stepping on somebody else's field. We're bad that way. But anyway, okay, so what we'll try to do is take everything that we've done. And the point of your world stage project then is to write a paper of where is your country on this stage and how did it kind of get there? And you can use all three of the essays you've already written to do it. There will just need to be that little piece of new information of where are they now and how do they fit in with the big picture now. So that's where we're working towards. Starting next week, it'll be overarching trends instead of chronological stuff. So good luck. It'll be fun for all of us. Any questions?